Good morning, everyone, and welcome to How to Successfully Implement PKI, a joint webinar between Keyfactor and Thales. Thanks for your time this morning. Before we start, a few things to note. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded. Microphones for you all have been switched off. If you have a question to ask the presenters, please use the Q&A tab and type your message in there, and we shall ask the questions at the end of the presentation. If there happen to be too many questions, then we'll aim to provide written answers to those questions not covered. So thank you all for attending, and now I'm going to pass you over to our two presenters, Tomas and Craig, who will introduce themselves. Tomas.
Thanks, John. I'm Tomas Gustavsson, Chief PKI Officer at Keyfactor and calling out of Stockholm in Sweden. So I've been working with PKI since the mid-90s and started EWCA open source PKI back in 2001. So I've been working a long time with this, doing most of the things that you can do, both development, implementing solutions worldwide and such. So looking forward. Over to you.
My name's Craig Read. I work for Thales Secure Information and Communication Systems, abbreviated as SICS. Technical architect. Been working in sort of secure networks for a number of years in the company now. PKIs and key management are sort of areas that I sort of concentrate on quite a bit. Background was a systems engineer for quite a while, and actually sort of cut my teeth really working on tactical data links for the military and in various different government domains. So sort of a traditional sort of systems engineering type background. What we're going to talk about. So first thing we're going to talk about is, what is PKI and why do we care about it? Tomas is going to talk a bit about, the problems potentially with, things like too many certificates and look at some of the, industrial trends as well. We're going to talk about, why business process is important when it comes to PKI and why it's probably overlooked a little bit and we need to concentrate on it. We're going to look at the skills deficit in the area because it's generally skills in this area are quite hard to come by. We found that as a business, and I think probably some of you on the call can probably relate to that. A quick sort of canter through the regulatory landscape and what that looks like, and a view as to the potential options for deployment, on-prem and so on. So what is PKI and why should we care? Well, PKI really is about building trust into systems. So it's enabling entities, be they web applications, be they pieces of software, whatever it happens to be trusted and validated by individuals or organizations using a trusted third party, and that trusted third party effectively being the PKI, which orchestrates that trust through a sort of a common root of trust. So it's all about protecting identity so that when a system or you are communicating with something, that entity is who they claim to be, and that's all sort of done through certificates within the system. You actually interact with it all the time. Most people don't realise that they do, but if you're using e-banking or, well, to be honest with you, most web services these days are HTTPS, so they're all using certificate-based authentication, and for things like software updates and so on, again, are all backed off through things like code signing so that that software that you receive is legitimate. It's used in things like ID passes that we use to get around our buildings. A lot of those are underpinned with certificates. So I guess what I'm saying is that PKI is kind of a bit of a background tool, if you like, that facilitates a whole bunch of use cases. And I remember my boss saying to me, how do we get people interested in PKI? And my answer is really, you don't. You get people interested in the use cases that it facilitates, and you say that it's the tool that provides the means to do that in a secure and controlled fashion. So a bit more about it. Technically, how hard is it to do? Well, There's a lot of options to deploying PKI. I actually deployed PKI at home as part of my network access control because I'm a bit geeky like that and like to play with some of these things. But the technical elements obviously aren't necessarily totally trivial, but they are probably the 20% really. The 80% is how you manage this and the governance and control mechanisms that you put around it. So take my PKI at home. The root CA was on a Raspberry Pi in a drawer, not particularly secure. And I hadn't really taken into account when things would expire. So what happened is my home network collapsed because my certificates all expired and I hadn't managed it properly. So, which is fine at home. It was done as a bit of fun, so it wasn't really an issue. But it's obviously a different kettle of fish when you're dealing with when you're providing, say, critical software or you're providing critical services. You can't afford things like that to happen. So the governance and controls are very, very important. If it goes wrong, you risk things like reputational damage. There are instances where when PKIs themselves were badly managed or secrets were leaked, that there have been quite sort of severe consequences, not just for the business that was hosting it, but also for all the services that PKI underpinned. Like I said, it's a tool that underpins a whole bunch of services. And you're also looking at a whole bunch of, these days, looking at the threat of regulatory fines and through regulation and even government intervention. So it's important to get the governance right. The technology is something to concentrate on, but the governance is kind of the important element, I would say. And I think the industry's been changing over the last few years, and Tomas is going to talk us through some of those sort of the trends that we've been seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. First, kind of walking through a couple of industry trends that are driving the increased usage of PKI that we're seeing now. And there are things like decentralized PKI models, where you have PKI for many new use cases and in many new places in a larger organization, but you still need to maintain centralized control of it to have that governance that Craig just talked about. So we'll talk slightly more about that. And there's a constant drive to have more short-lived certificate. We used to live in a world where certificates were issued with a validity period of, say, even 5 years. But now there's a drive, especially driven by things like public web certificates, which the validity periods are shortened constantly. And that is, of course, to minimize the risk of compromise, but it also, of course, increases risk of expiration outages. And there are other many, say, regulatory things, and one that is driving at the moment are key attestation requirements, where CABFIRM is coming out with new requirements for code signing certificates, which is another good use case for certificates, where they require usage of hardware security modules to protect the private signing keys in order to minimize compromise, because compromise of signature keys actually affects and puts risk on whole ecosystems, which is what we want to limit. And last but not least, there is what you call a post-quantum revolution, or the migration to future quantum-safe cryptographic algorithms. All the algorithms that we rely on today, that is primarily RSA and elliptic curves, will be migrated, kind of starting from now and going on for a decade or so at least, to new algorithms that are safe from the potential threat that future quantum computers may pose. And what we're seeing are a lot more machines that needs security, need secure communication, and that needs certificates. And that drives a lot of need for trust in the whole ecosystem within organizations and between organizations. And one thing that a Gartner report says that the number of machines, which are workloads and devices, outnumber humans by an order of magnitudes. So yeah, we all need to establish tooling and processes to control these. And of course, it's not to diminish the use of human, security, the classic IAM, identity cards and things like Craig pointed to. That is all super important, of course, still, and will continue to be. It's just that the machines are now driving scale and volumes that we're not necessarily used to before. And some things that are driving use cases for PKI, we did a survey not this year, which asks organizations what factors are driving usage of certificates and PKI in their organizations. And on the top comes things like zero trust, because that means that every machine has to communicate securely with every other machine, and moving to cloud. Typically, zero trust and cloud might be kind of connected initiatives in organizations. But we also see things like DevOps and IoT, which are, for a software supply chains or devices in organizations that needs more security that classically haven't been secured so much. While we see things like work from home is declining as a driver, which is, I would say, natural, because we had a huge drive due to that, a couple of years ago during the pandemic. But most organizations have kind of gone through that phase, which is why we can sit here and talk to this, from Stockholm and from other places in the world. So we've been past the big wave of that, so to say. And the survey also shows that the average organization have more than, or at least 255,000 certificates and 9 different PKI or CA solutions. So the more certificates you have, the more governance or control you need to have to not risk outages, as Craig was talking about. And what we're seeing, or we call things the problem of PKI sprawl, which is, classically when new use cases rises in organizations, there are fast-paced teams that need to have security tools now, and they can't wait maybe to go to a central organization and ask for a solution that takes several months to set up. So that results in different tools being set up in different parts of the organization. Not necessarily bad tools, but usually some built-in things which are not maybe the department's or the team's core competency. So this leads to where the organization doesn't have any central governance. So it which means both policy, of course, like security, compliance, which we'll go more into, lacking hardware security modules, but also kind of no control of certificate expirations leading to outages. So this is important to get this thing under control. And that's why I'll hand over to Craig to talk about these important processes.
Yeah, so thanks, Thomas. So we kind of think of PKI to be broken down into sort of 4 building blocks. We think about it in this way. You have the business logic, which is what is the PKI there to do and what is it there to support. Then you've got the back end capability, which is the HSMs, the root CA, the issuing CA, things like OCSP services, etc., etc. And then you've got the interaction mechanism between the business logic and that core backend, which is effectively the enrollment mechanisms. And all of this is underpinned by a service support and maintenance sort of layer, if you like, particularly if you're buying, PKI as a service rather than sort of rolling it yourself. What we tend to see when we're interacting with clients is that there is a very big focus on the core capability backend. So we will see clients talk about how many HSMs they need, how many CAs they need, what algorithms they want to use. So they tend to focus there. For us, really, we try to encourage our customers to forget initially, forget the core back end and concentrate more on what the PKI is there and trying to do. So going back to some of Thomas's points, we're seeing trends where PKI is increasingly being used to support OT environments. Is that the use case here? Is it being used to control access to your buildings? Is it being used to control or detect, devices that connect to your network, or is it being used to manage and control software being delivered securely, or are you using it to, manage inter-site connectivity? It's really about thinking about what the use case actually is, and then taking that a step further, because this will help you understand what the back end needs to look like and what your processes need to be. Incidentally, there's documentation that's produced typically with PKIs. You have a certificate policy which kind of outlines what the PKI is there to do, and then you have something called a certificate practice statement, which effectively outlines how the PKI meets the obligations of that policy. But these are the sorts of questions that are going to influence the PKI that's instantiated. So, for example, how important is it that it's hosted in your home country? What sort of volumes of certificates are you looking at? Are you dealing with tens of certificates, hundreds of certificates, millions of certificates? How are they typically enrolled? Are they enrolled in big batches, say of 250,000 a time, or is it a general sort of sweeping, rolling one every few seconds, sort of continuous kind of system? What level of service do you actually need in terms of availability? How does it need to be 99.99, for example? And that will depend on how you roll your certificates and how frequently. So if let's say you're supporting a manufacturing process and you're producing 10,000 items and you're injecting certificates into those items on a production line, you're probably going to know that several weeks in advance. So you're going to have quite a lot of warning to cut those certificates, and you're not necessarily going to be cutting them in real time on the production line. Again, it depends on your use case. Things that perhaps will affect the implementation a little more will be, what sort of system are we supporting? Is it a safety critical system? Is it commercial? Is it banking? They will all come with a set of potential constraints that we need to operate within. But these things are really important to flesh out. So we always draw back to that to try and understand what exactly the PKI is there to do, and work out how it might facilitate it. Because if you concentrate on the core back end too much initially, there is a danger that you'll put something in place that's potentially more cost than it needs to be, and potentially more complicated than it needs to be. So getting the needs understood and the business logic understood will really help you understand what a cost-effective solution looks like, and you kind of need skills for that. You need to work with people like ourselves, or you need in-house skills, and that sort of leads us nicely on to what Tomas is going to talk about, which is what's the state of skills in PKI at the moment.
Thanks, Craig. Absolutely, and security skills are something that we all struggle, to find and retain. And in our survey, a majority of organizations say that they don't have enough staff to deploy and manage PKI. So it's actually one of the top issues companies are struggling with. So the only place where you find a decent set of security skills are, of course, on the conferences and on webinars like this, where we tend to crowd around. But it's not only skills. Another challenge for organization is that the tools are inadequate or fragmented, at least. So there's lots of great tools out there, but it's hard to find a thing that covers the whole set of requirements that you have, because it's also a fast evolving area, cybersecurity, of course. So we there's a lot of new innovation happening, and everything like that. So there's a lot of tools out there, and you have to find the right ones that for your use case, and that fits in your organization together with your processes, your compliance requirements, and everything. And not every tool fits every use case, so it's definitely a challenge for organizations, especially as the skills are also hard to find. Then I've kind of outlining a solution for this is to have kind of the standard template solution is to have visibility. You want to have discover capabilities, you want to know your PKIs, your CAs, your networks and devices, so you can control them or have governance and visibility across them all. And then you want to have controls to enforce policies, both security, compliance, regulation, and simplify enrollment to relieve your staff from old manual processes. And of course, you need to be in control there. And finally, automation. So that's where you really, with the skills shortage, the only way to do more with less, which is what organizations have to do in this time, is to automate things. So things that in the past we talked to customers who used to have maybe hundreds different servers, and they could operate that manually to renew certificates and keep a Excel spreadsheet about the expirations. But now the same organizations were facing in the new things are moving to cloud and DevOps. They had starting to reach thousands of servers or workloads. Then manual procedures are not sufficient anymore, so you need to automate, and which actually turns out in the end, when you're done with that, it's good, because then you have freeing up time for the staff to do more important things than kind of manual tasks of renewing certificates. So that reduces a lot of friction and risk. And then over to Craig again to talk about the important regulatory landscape.
Yeah, this is another element when considering how you're going to implement PKI services. Obviously, depending on your business, there's going to be an entire regulatory landscape that's associated with that. So you've got government regulations and processes. You've got specific regulations that operate within things like critical national infrastructure, power generation, water, general communications, that kind of thing. Defence have got a whole raft of their own internal sort of documentation on PKI implementation as well, and then banking and finance again have their own. So there's a whole ecosystem of sort of regulations and best practice depending on where you are, and this is obviously particularly pertinent if the system being supported is safety critical. So that's something certainly to be mindful of and try to get a handle of, and it's not easy. The other areas I think is there's general sort of guidance and best practice with respect to operational regulation as well. So there are things like there are sort of normal standards. There's standards on how to manage secrets, for example, within UK government. You've also got items that may add complexity if you're engaging, for example, with public service networks. You'll have code of connection to consider and things like that. Then there's equipment as well. If your PKI, and most strong PKIs are backed off by HSMs, you'll need to consider devices that have the appropriate compliance, CAPS approval, FIPS compliant, and so on. And then there's general regulations to be aware of. PKIs may be used to manage people's personal credentials. So things like GDPR will sort of factor into that. So getting an understanding of how your regulatory landscape looks is going to influence the way in which you develop your certificate policy, and fundamentally how you respond to that policy or build a system that meets it. The other thing to think about is the purpose of the PKI and whether or not it needs to be public. So if you are exchanging information, for example, signing documentation and exchanging it with third parties, the PKI that you use, you might want to use something that's public, in which case you might be looking at things like EIDAS as a route there, or using a PKI that has it, because this means that machines that receive that information will recognise the certificates cut by that PKI without having to do sort of complicated federation or passing root certificates around and things like that. It makes things much simpler. So it is a step to take, and it's highly dependent on the use case, and it's highly dependent on the business within which you're operating. In terms of deployment models, there are sort of a number. You can buy fully managed services where you can work with the provider to make sure that the certificate's being provided by within reason, probably using a template of some description, meet the requirements that you have, probably suitable for relatively small scale deployments of certificates, maybe if you're doing things like code signing or whatever, or if it's something that you want to outsource and don't want to get involved in because obviously it's complicated and you need people and you need the skills. It probably adds an additional layer of complexity when we're dealing with high assurance situations. So particularly when we're dealing with, say, certain government customers or defence customers, then you've got additional constraints on there that you may have to deal with, things like, sites need to be ListX, etc., etc. You can look at on-premise deployments, so building your own. Companies like ours can help, with the design of that and development of that, and then instantiate it and hand it over so that you can effectively operate it yourselves from within your business. Or it can be, a hybrid of these things, really, depending on what it is you want to do and where you want to use the PKI. There may be a multitude of use cases that you have, and in some instances it might make sense to use PKI as a service. In others, it might make sense to use on-premise solutions. And then what's not, things that aren't on this slide are things like cloud deployments as well. Not that it could be a sovereign system of your own, but you're using a third-party cloud to deploy it. So there's a number of options here that relate to your deployment models that you could go with.
Yeah, I think one thing to kind of emphasize here is that there is no one bullet fits all. As we talked about, the average number of PKIs is 9 in large organizations, and there may be definitely good reasons to consolidate some PKIs to have governance and control. But many use cases are so different. For example, you may not be able to mix a high assurance PKI with another kind of enterprise IT system in the same deployment. It just doesn't fit from a compliance perspective. So most organizations will have the need for some, I call them PKI silos for different things. Some things might have to be on premise because you have maybe even offline requirements, so it can't be put in the cloud. So there are good ways to have control and governance even if you have a hybrid mixed environment.
Yeah, there's many options. So Thales and Keyfactor have been working together since 2016 in this sort of area, delivering PKI solutions and working with customers. Thales is a fairly large organisation, 80,000 strong, sort of 70 countries. But this is a key area for us. It's a key area within which we work in, and we've been partnered with Keyfactor for some time in this area.
Yeah, we have a long, successful partnership. And Keyfactor, of course, is a lot smaller than Thales, and we're highly focused on PKI and machine identity management to work with Thales on many larger solutions. We're still globally working together.
And it's been good. Okay. Thank you very much for listening to us. I guess we can open up to some questions, John.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to find the first one. One of them was I've had a solution that does not use PKI today, so why should I implement PKI now? Bernie also provided some answers. So said the driver years ago was wireless access 8021X. Now you need certificates part of Windows Hello to log on to domains. You can then use these as part of your authentication to Zora proxy, Okta gateway, and other zero trust mechanisms. So there was already an answer on the chat. Thomas, Craig, do you want to add to the response?
I'll add to it first. I think again there are ways to do a lot of things that PKI does for you, or helps you do in a secure way. I guess my question would be, almost turn it back, is why? What is it your business does, and how important is it that it's done in a secure way? So an example would be if you're delivering software, for example, and you're delivering builds and you're passing that over to your customers. Signing that using object signing backed off by a strong PKI provides the assurance to the third party that when they receive that code, that it's the genuine article and it's been produced by you. If you don't back that off with some sort of PKI types code signing mechanism, then there's no way that you'll ever know that it's been tampered with or that it's originated from a genuine party, if you like. So it depends on what your use case is, but fundamentally PKI provides a strong secure base for many operations. And if that's important to you, then my suggestion would be that PKI is something that you definitely want to be considering, and it's probably it's probably a bit of a must in some situations, particularly when we're talking things that are safety critical. I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to that, Thomas.
Yeah, no, there's just a bunch of new regulations coming up that may or may not affect your organization, of course, like the upcoming CRA in the EU, etc., and other in the financial industry and such. So if some of that affects you, then you may have to do it. If it doesn't affect you, it might be good anyway, due to kind of the heightened security awareness and risks that are rising today.
Thank you. I'm just moving through the list. So the next question was from Bernie. It said, moving to post-quantum algorithms, I've held back from moving from RSA to ECC, even due to the want to ensure that we've got backwards compatibility with browsers and systems. Is that a valid concern? How far back was ECC support, and how about hardware acceleration? So I think that's one for you, Thomas.
Yeah, I definitely, I was along when ECC came along. So in the beginning, it was definitely a valid concern. And say going back a decade, there were definitely still shakiness going on. But now, at this age and time, ECC is definitely robust. And we see many cases moving from RSA to ECC. RSA is actually starting to become a bit more concerned due to regulations and standards like FIPS compliance. Then it's really easier to with ECC today, and both hardware acceleration is really good, it's fast, etc. But then again, of course, when we're talking about we're soon facing a new cryptographic migration. So if you haven't started one now, you of course, depending on your use case, again as always, you might want to hold back and move to post-quantum immediately and not having to do two migrations. So that would probably be the short answer.
I did just get a comment, which is from Scott. Attestation linking critical keys to the validated hosting environment is worth expanding on. I'm not sure that applied to what you just said, or that was a separate one, but it just came in when you were talking, so I suspect
I would probably say slightly separate. So, I mean, attestations have been topic in our field for a long time, but it hasn't been as widely deployed except in some specific maybe regulated industries. But now there are more coming out kind of for public or affecting many more organizations, mainly due to code signing requirements for hardware security modules, where you need to be able to ensure to a certificate authority that your keys were generated in an HSM, etc. So there is standardization going on. The standardization field isn't stellar, I would say, in this area. So there are different solutions around for different use cases, but there is also standardization work going on. So it's something we're going to see a lot more in the coming years. That's almost certain.
Okay, thank you. Just going through the questions a little bit more. I had one here about from Urs, would you recommend to have a PKI for digital signing and encryption, a separate subordinate certificate authority to have it split out service-wise and security-wise, which I think, Craig, might be one for you.
It's an interesting question. I think it's probably it depends. I would say it depends on the use case fundamentally, and the security appetite of what it is you're trying to do. So there are reasons to do it. There are reasons that you might want to separate these things out and keep them separate. But if you want to keep things simpler, you can potentially use single PKIs to do multiple functions. So it does depend on the use case and the level of separation that is dictated to you, I would imagine. I don't really want to add anything to that, Thomas.
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay, I've got a question from Scott here saying, any plans to apply for Thales to be added to the Microsoft Trusted Root list?
Okay.
Craig.
Yeah, so we've been looking at this for some time because obviously there are distinct advantages. So rather than talking about Microsoft Trusted Root, there are distinct advantages of being a public PKI. It means that our ability to provide PKI services to clients is a lot more straightforward, particularly if they're just purchasing certificates from us, because they will be widely recognised by other machines without us having to get involved, effectively being on CAB forum. So I think that there is a desire that we pursue this, but I don't know at the moment the exact timescales, and it is certainly something that we're looking into. Thales as an organisation tends to provide PKI services to government type customers, and in most of the circumstances that we deal with these days, those PKIs tend to be quite insular, so they tend to be sort of internal within that organisation primarily, backing off systems and services that they're deploying. So it's less of an issue for those certificates to be recognised outside, but as we move to more commercial type clients, then this is obviously becoming much more prevalent. So it's an area that we're actively pursuing at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Craig. A question from Mukesh. Have you analysed the impact of using hybrid certificates? Then he says in brackets, I know the TLS standards are not there yet, but could you see that EJBCA supports dilithium certificates? Also, how about the root key? How are the root keys stored at this point? Any possibility to generate PKI secure keys in an HSM environment? I'm going to give that one to you, Thomas.
Yep, absolutely.
That's okay.
And, I think the answer is yes and yes. No, but seriously, so of course, hybrid certificates are definitely the topic, and they are heavily looked in different standardization organizations. For example, in the financial industry, it's a hot topic. So we're actually in the process of adding support for hybrid certificates or X509 alternative keys and signature certificates. So it's definitely something the industry and our industry will do. And yes, we are working together with Thales with HSM support for post-quantum. So we actually have that working in the test lab. So the issue right now is, of course, that the algorithms like dilithium isn't finished yet. So the standardization will be done early next year. So while we have it working with the current draft of the standards together, EWC and Thales HSMs, this is still only for test and proof of concept. And then, but we're ready once the final specs are out there. It will be in HSMs and it will be in our joint solutions. Once it's ready for production when the standards are out there.
Yeah. And then there's thank you, Thomas, a question from Bernie, who's expressing a concern about the lack of skilled engineers, which is, I think everyone sees as a pretty significant issue in the marketplace. It says, at what point in time is Keyfactor and Thales going to make a PKI light turnkey service in a marketplace to auto-deploy HSM-backed certificates to devices? Most companies' requirements for zero trust are the same across the board. Basically, why couldn't this be automated? I'm going to hand that over to you in a second, both of you. But I think one of the things as well is, with the lack of skilled engineers, I think it's also up to companies to be also helping support that. So Thales, for example, has a campus in Vale, and part of that is outreach into the local community, schools, trying to encourage people into careers in cybersecurity and the software side. We also support postgraduate studies, and we also employ people and interns, because I think we all have a role to play, especially as big companies, in ensuring there is a pool of engineers. But then I'm going to hand over to Craig first, if that's all right.
So is the question, are we looking at developing some sort of a turnkey solution? So we're talking basically off-the-shelf purchase of a PKI system or a PKI service that you can just utilize for whatever. I would say that's something that Thales has been doing for a little while. We do have a set of product lines that help us here. So we have things like HSM as a service, for example, out of our digital our DIS business line. But we're also looking, as I say, we are deploying PKI as a service today. So if you have a requirement where you don't want to be instantiating your own system, your own solution, there are options for you right now that we can talk about.
And I might add that for kind of our EWCA, for example, we do have automation tools like Ansible that can also automate the whole configuration of a system, including the HSM, as long as you have the HSM set up, even for on-premise solutions. But so I think for a kind of PKI itself, it's possible to automate it and do it very convenient. But then, of course, there is more integration into the ecosystem, be it Kubernetes or things like that, which are also suffering from immaturity. So I think the integration part is where it's not, you might be able to find something that looks like a turnkey solution, but if you scratch deep enough, it might not be. So there are lots of complexities in the ecosystem to actually put it to work.
Yeah,
Thank you. I think with the question asked, I think it's also something definitely we need to go away and think about more as well, because now that it's been sort of, there's been a request.
Great input.
Definitely. I got more questions. So, Julian, is it possible to migrate an on-premise entrust PKI with existing root CA, sub-CA, and end entity certificates to an on-premise EJBCA PKI?
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess, Craig, that's also what we do.
Yeah.
Help companies do that. So it will be a double yes from our side. Next question from Dan. I've struggled to find PKI resources, so considering equipping my existing team with new skills, where do you recommend to go for good quality training in PKI? Are there any certifications? Craig?
It's not something I know an awful lot about the detailed training in this area, so I don't know whether Thomas can shed some light on it. But what I do know is that working with Keyfactor, when we've delivered sort of on-premise solutions, we build training into those offerings. So, and that training is about how you deploy the software, how you manage the software, and so on. But there's also layers in that highlight things like the requirements for role-based role delineation of responsibility through role and things like that. So again. The technical element of the training is there, that 20%, but on top of that, you need that 80% to understand, how to actually deploy the thing in the first place. So as although I can't lay my hands on the name of a specific course, it's something that we tend to do whenever we're delivering PKI as an on-premise solution for a client. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Tom?
No, I think I'm also not aware of any, let's say, public certifications around it. I know, of course, things like CISSP do contain PKI, parts of it in, and we have a lot of resources online for techies to, do even YouTube videos and guides like that you can learn a lot about, but it probably requires a bit of background knowledge about kind of the basics of the PKI, which I hope is included in university courses today. But yeah, it might be a good thing to have better base training available easily, which is it's a complex topic. So.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And I think this is the last question. And I think it might be a question that we might actually have to come back on, but because I know that that in Thales we do have an expert on the automotive sector. Craig, you might be able to answer it. I'm not sure, but it says, can you please shed some light on PKI in automotive ECUs?
ECU, yeah. So it's a very open-ended sort of thing, but I think there's a lot. Speaking generally about the automotive industry, I think there are a lot of things that you need to think about here. So the way that code signing is obviously something that's being actively explored and is in use within the automotive industry to manage code that's delivered to ECUs. My understanding, and again, I imagine this changes from manufacturer to manufacturer, is that the implementations of that are utilize PKI to an extent, but not in a way that you would see it used in an IT or OT environment necessarily. So there are good reasons for that. One of the reasons is that a lot of ECUs deployed within vehicles don't have things like hardware acceleration built in for some of the cryptographic algorithms that typical PKIs support, for example. And due to the cost sensitivities in the automotive industry, there needs to be a good reason to do it. So although I would say it's not deployed in a way that a typical PKI would normally be deployed in the automotive industry, particularly within cars, I think it is moving in that direction, and I think that, different OEMs will be at different stages. It's not just the ECUs though. It's all the back end services that where that support it all. So for things like software generation, information management, interconnectivity. I mean, PKI certificates are probably certainly in use for interconnectivity between vehicles and backends. But the actual inside communications, it's probably a bit different. So it's a very vague answer, I know, but and we do some work in this area. But that's probably the best answer I can give you. So it's very variable, and there are a number of constraints that kind of limit its application. But I would say the trend is that's improving because it has to.
And I would say that thank you, Craig, for that. If you want to dig into more detail, then please get in contact in the email that will get sent out after this with links to the slides and the recording. There will be my email addresses in there, so if anyone has specific questions, you can send them to me and then we can follow up afterwards. I have one final question, and it's from Charles, and he said, could you recommend some resources or readings on or reading material on PKI implementation with a focus on governance aspects? And the second part, which is also quite a big question, what solutions would you use if you were to build an on-premise PKI from a clean sheet? You want to go first, Craig, and then Thomas?
They're very big questions. I can't think of anything specific in terms of reading material. I think some of the material on if you look on the Keyfactor and Thales websites, you're probably going to find some very good explanations and some good reading material there. So that's probably would be my first port of call. And I think that you'll probably find that due to the nature of our business, that we're going to create that material coming from the sort of the high assurance governance and government types start. So that's probably is a good indicator. What solutions would I use if I'm building a PKI premise, a PKI from clean sheet? Well, obviously Thales HSMs and obviously Keyfactor software. So, but there are multiple options. I mean, you could look at things like Microsoft ADCS, for example. There's other HSM providers out there. It's important, I think, for customers to realise they're not locked in. But yes, obviously, from my perspective, that's probably where I would start.
Yeah, we have different kind of levels of packaging depending on your exact requirements. If you want virtual machines or containers or pure software, but I would definitely start thinking about the governance aspects.
Yeah.
Actually, I did find a book that I bought kind of to newcomers at Keyfactor a couple of years ago about around the governance, basics about PKI and governance. I don't remember the name of the book on top of my head, but written by some of the old-time PKI gurus that's been around since the 90s. It was a pretty good read, covering the kind of the general governance things to think about. So there's more out there.
Send me that.
Yeah, and maybe we can, if you can find out, we can put a link into the handout so people can come back and get that. I think that's all of the questions. I think it only remains for me to thank everybody for the time they've spent. I hope everyone's found this useful. You will get a poll when you leave the webinar. Please, if you have time, respond, because it helps us make these sessions more useful for everybody. So we want this to be useful. So please take the time to comment. If there are any more questions that come in from now, we will record them and we will try and get back to you with an answer. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you at a future webinar.